Across three southeastern states, more than 26 million Americans make their homes in landscapes marked by rolling hills, sprawling farmland, and vibrant inland cities. Yet along hundreds of miles of nearby shoreline, the picture is remarkably different. Despite lying on one of the most iconic coasts in the world, this area lacks the dense skylines, port megacities, and packed tourist corridors that define places like New York, Boston, or Miami. For much of its length, the shoreline feels open and lightly settled, almost empty compared to the bustling Atlantic seaboard most people imagine. This surprising reality belongs not to some remote frontier, but to the East Coast itself. And that contrast raises a compelling question. Why? Why would a region with such direct access to the Atlantic remain so thinly populated, while inland cities just a few hours away have grown into major powerhouses? The answer is not simple, nor is it tied to just one moment in history. Instead, it is the product of centuries of geography, economics, and human decisions, each layering onto the next to shape a coastline that looks nothing like the rest of the East Coast. Let's explore the reasons together in the following video. Unfavorable natural geography. One of the most fundamental reasons why this stretch of the East Coast has remained so lightly populated lies in its natural geography. Unlike the harbors of New York, Boston, or even Norfolk, which are deep, naturally sheltered, and well-suited for international trade, much of the coastline of the Carolinas and Georgia is made up of shifting barrier islands, tidal marshes, and flat sandy shores. These features may be picturesque, but they are inhospitable for large-scale urban development. Barrier islands in particular are narrow, constantly reshaped by tides and storms, and highly unstable for permanent infrastructure. Studies by the U.S. Geological Survey note that barrier islands along this coast migrate landward by as much as several meters per year due to erosion and rising seas, making them among the most dynamic landforms in North America. Such conditions make it nearly impossible to build durable ports or dense cities in the way that natural deep-water harbors further north allowed. The rivers that empty into the Atlantic here also lacked the capacity to propel large-scale international commerce. While waterways such as the Savannah River and Cape Fear River provided some inland navigation and supported regional trade, they could not match the strategic advantages of the Mississippi River system or the St. Lawrence Seaway, which connected vast continental interiors to global markets. Historian Walter Edgar, in his History of South Carolina, emphasizes that while Charleston became a regional hub in the colonial era, it never reached the scale of northern cities precisely because its waterways were too shallow and its coastline too fragmented to support the same level of maritime industry. Moreover, the coastal plain itself is low-lying and swampy, riddled with estuaries and wetlands that made transportation and construction difficult for centuries. Early European settlers often described the region as beautiful but treacherous, with marshlands breeding disease and sandy soils limiting agricultural expansion beyond plantations. Even in modern times, much of this land remains prone to erosion and flooding, raising the long-term costs of urbanization. For instance, NOAA data show that between 1960 and 2023, sea levels along the mid-Atlantic coast rose by roughly 8 inches, a rate that already accelerates the vulnerability of small towns and infrastructure. Therefore, the very shape and character of this coastline prevented it from becoming a natural magnet for dense settlement. While the Northeast could build global cities around natural harbors and Florida could capitalize on tourism-friendly beaches, the southeastern Atlantic shore was left with landscapes too unstable, too shallow, and too flood-prone to support the same trajectory of growth. So what do you think? Could this region ever overcome its natural challenges to become a major hub? Or will geography always hold it back? Harsh climate and natural disasters. If geography created natural limits, the climate of this stretch of the East Coast made long-term settlement even more challenging. The region sits squarely within the hurricane belt of the Atlantic, where powerful storms regularly make landfall. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, between 1851 and 2020, the coastlines of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were directly struck by over 200 tropical cyclones, with more than 80 of them reaching hurricane strength. This means that on average, a significant storm has hit the area roughly once every 2 years for nearly 2 centuries. Such frequency is not just an occasional disruption, but a structural barrier to sustained coastal development. The impact of these storms has been severe. Hurricane Hugo in 1989, one of the most powerful hurricanes ever to strike the United States, devastated Charleston and surrounding areas, causing $11 billion in damages in today's dollars and leaving 56,000 people homeless. More recently, Hurricane Florence in 2018 brought catastrophic flooding across eastern North Carolina, inundating entire towns and causing nearly $24 billion in losses. These disasters, recurring every generation, have shaped both local memory and national perceptions of the region as a risky place to live or invest heavily in infrastructure. Beyond hurricanes, the everyday climate also poses challenges. Summers are hot, humid, and long, with average July highs reaching 91 degrees Fahrenheit in coastal South Carolina and Georgia. This level of humidity historically contributed to outbreaks of diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which devastated coastal populations during the 18th and 19th centuries. Historian Peter McCandless, in Slavery, Disease, and Suffering in the Southern Lowcountry, documents how entire communities in the Lowcountry would flee inland during sickly seasons, leaving towns half empty for months at a time. Though modern medicine has erased that specific danger, the climatic reputation lingered and discouraged dense settlement patterns compared to more temperate coastal regions further north. In modern times, climate change is compounding these vulnerabilities. Noam A. reports that sea levels along the southeastern Atlantic coast are projected to rise by at least 1 foot by 2050, a change that will dramatically increase the frequency of sunny day flooding and amplify storm surges during hurricanes. For small towns and counties with limited tax bases, the costs of building and maintaining protective infrastructure are daunting. As a result, large-scale coastal growth has never taken off here in the way it did in Florida, where booming tourism economies provided resources for seawalls, drainage systems, and rebuilding after storms. Historical development and economic orientation toward the interior. History also played a decisive role in why this portion of the East Coast never developed dense urban centers. During the colonial period in the 17th and 18th centuries, the region was indeed home to important seaports such as Charleston and Savannah. However, unlike Boston, New York, or Philadelphia, which grew into financial and cultural capitals, these southern ports functioned primarily as gateways for plantation economies built on rice, indigo, and later cotton. Wealth was concentrated in rural estates rather than in cities, and as historian Peter Koklanis notes in The Shadow of a Dream, Charleston's elite deliberately resisted urban expansion, preferring to keep economic and political power rooted in the countryside. This meant that the coast never developed the dense commercial and manufacturing base that fueled northern urbanization. By the 19th century, the pattern had become even more pronounced. The invention of the cotton gin and the spread of cotton cultivation shifted economic gravity further inland, toward the Piedmont and the Mississippi Valley. Railroads that emerged in the mid-19th century reinforced this orientation, running westward into the interior rather than northward along the coast. For example, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which eventually connected Virginia to Florida, primarily served to transport agricultural products inland rather than to concentrate commerce in coastal towns. The coastal plain thus became more of a transit corridor than a destination, leaving its cities relatively small compared to the rapidly industrializing centers of the Northeast and Midwest. The devastation of the Civil War in the mid-19th century also played a major part. Charleston and Savannah were heavily damaged, and reconstruction efforts faltered in the face of economic collapse and political instability. Unlike northern cities, which emerged from the war with booming industries, southern coastal towns struggled for decades. By the early 20th century, census data showed that Charleston's population was under 70,000, while Boston had already surpassed 700,000, and New York had grown into a metropolis of more than 3 million. These stark differences underscored how far the southeastern coast had fallen behind as an urban hub. Even in the 20th century, economic growth in the South tended to cluster inland rather than on the coast. The rise of textile mills in the Piedmont, followed by automobile and manufacturing industries in places like Atlanta and Charlotte, pulled resources and people away from the shore. The coastal zone, still vulnerable to storms and reliant on limited port trade, never regained its earlier prominence. So the East Coast today presents a striking contrast. Dense megacities in the north and booming metropolises, separated by a long, relatively quiet stretch of shoreline where history and economics align to keep population growth restrained. Weak infrastructure and limited transportation connectivity. Another major factor that has kept this vast stretch of the East Coast sparsely populated is the persistent weakness of its infrastructure, especially when compared with other regions of the United States. Geography already made construction difficult, but human choices compounded the problem. Unlike the northeastern seaboard, where deep natural harbors encouraged the building of ports, and where the 19th century saw dense networks of railroads linking cities to one another, the southeastern coast developed far fewer reliable connections. By the late 19th century, the Northeast already boasted continuous rail corridors from Boston to Washington, D.C., while much of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia remained served only by scattered branch lines that often ran inland rather than parallel to the ocean. This lack of integration meant that even when local towns grew, they were not well connected to the wider national economy. The problem persisted into the automobile era. When the United States began constructing the interstate highway system in the mid-20th century, much of the emphasis was placed on connecting northern and midwestern industrial hubs or linking inland southern cities such as Atlanta and Charlotte. The coastal plain, by contrast, received fewer direct investments. Interstate 95, completed in the latter half of the 20th century, runs along the East Coast and does pass through the Carolinas and Georgia. But its design prioritized long-haul traffic moving between the Northeast and Florida rather than encouraging the development of intermediate urban centers. As a result, many towns along this corridor became known more as stopovers for travelers than as destinations in their own right. Port development also lagged. While Savannah and Charleston maintained commercial significance, they never reached the scale of New York, Baltimore, or even Miami. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, by the early 21st century, the Port of Savannah handled about 4.5 million TEUs annually. Impressive by regional standards, but still dwarfed by New York and New Jersey, which processed more than 9 million TEUs in 2019 alone. The inability to scale up port facilities and integrate them with inland rail and trucking networks meant that the economic multiplier effect of global trade never translated into large-scale urban expansion. Rural infrastructure within the coastal plain remained underdeveloped as well. Even in the 21st century, large parts of eastern North Carolina and South Carolina face limited broadband access, aging road networks, and underfunded utilities. A 2021 report from the Federal Communications Commission found that more than 20% of rural households in this region still lacked reliable high-speed internet, one of the highest proportions along the East Coast. These deficits discourage both private investment and in-migration, reinforcing the perception of the area as isolated despite its proximity to the Atlantic. And if you find this exploration fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories behind the world's geography. Social factors and cultural perceptions. Beyond geography, history, and infrastructure, social dynamics and cultural perceptions have also shaped why this long stretch of the East Coast remains so thinly populated. Since the late 19th century, national narratives about the American South have often highlighted poverty, backwardness, and isolation. During the mid-20th century, these perceptions hardened when journalists covering President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty turned their cameras toward rural communities in Appalachia and the coastal Carolinas. Images of dilapidated homes, barefoot children, and limited opportunities became shorthand for the forgotten South, discouraging migration and investment at a time when other regions were booming. Even though conditions varied widely within the region, the persistence of such stereotypes reinforced its marginal status in the American imagination. Economic statistics reinforced these impressions. Throughout much of the 20th century, median household incomes in coastal counties of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia lagged well below the national average. By the year 2000, poverty rates in many eastern North Carolina counties remained higher than the national rate. Educational attainment levels also trailed. As late as 2014, fewer than 20% of adults in several rural coastal counties had a bachelor's degree compared with over 30% nationwide. These gaps discouraged industries dependent on skilled labor from relocating there, reinforcing a cycle of low-wage employment and outmigration. Race and segregation further complicated the region's trajectory. The coastal plain is home to significant African American and Native American populations, particularly the Gula Geechee communities stretching from coastal North Carolina to Florida. While these groups contributed enormously to the region's cultural richness, they also face systemic discrimination, exclusion from economic opportunities, and underfunded public services throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Jim Crow laws entrenched inequality, and even after civil rights legislation in the 1960s, disparities in housing, schooling, and healthcare limited the pace of development. The perception of the area as socially divided and resistant to progress further dissuaded outside investment. Cultural perception continues to matter today. While Florida markets itself as glamorous and cosmopolitan, and while northern cities are associated with opportunity and dynamism, the middle section of the East Coast is often framed in media and popular culture as rural, slow-moving, or flyover territory. Tourism campaigns highlight its natural beauty, quiet beaches, marshes, and historic towns. But this very branding emphasizes its remoteness rather than its potential as a major urban hub. Therefore, the region thrives as a place to visit briefly, but not as a destination for large-scale migration or economic clustering. In this way, cultural images and social realities have worked hand in hand with geography, history, and infrastructure to shape the East Coast population pattern. What might seem surprising at first, that such a vast strategic area remains lightly settled, turns out to be the result of generations of narratives, policies, and perceptions reinforcing one another. Stretching between the crowded skylines of the Northeast and the booming resorts, this portion of the East Coast stands out as a paradox. A landscape rich in history, culture, and natural beauty, yet largely untouched by the kind of dense settlement that defines other parts of America's shoreline. Its challenges, geographic, historical, infrastructural, and social, did not arise overnight but accumulated over centuries, leaving behind a region that is both connected to and strangely apart from the nation's story. Today, it remains a place of contrasts. On the one hand, small towns and quiet beaches preserve a sense of authenticity that other coastal areas long ago surrendered to development. On the other, persistent poverty, limited infrastructure, and enduring stereotypes keep it from realizing its full potential. The result is a coastline that feels suspended in time, neither fully urban nor entirely forgotten, existing in the shadows of its better-known neighbors,